I'm really just delighted to invite Roger Kuo, who is the president of Duggan Cox, to introduce Governor Kugler. Roger is also a member of Duggan Cox's board of directors and is a member of the firm's International Equity and Global Equity Investment Committees. He's been with Duggan Cox since 1998 and has been an important part of the company's strong relationship with SIEPR over the years. And I'm so grateful for Duggan Cox's corporate sponsorship of the summit this year and in the years past. The company's former CEO, John Gunn, was the longtime chair of the SIEPR Advisory Board and has always been one of SIEPR's greatest champions. And another former CEO, Ken Olivier, has been a tremendous advisory board member at SIEPR for many years too. I'm so happy that Roger is with us today, and a very big thank you to him and again to Duggan Cox for their support. After Governor Kugler's remarks, I'll kick off a brief Q&A with her before opening things up for your questions. So thanks again for being here, Roger, and here you go.
Thanks for the introduction, Mark. Duggan Cox, as you referenced, takes great pride in having sponsored the SIEPR Economic Summit for now more than 15 years. Our firm takes a long-term approach towards investing in the global markets, evaluating both fundamental and economic drivers, and our partnership with SIEPR and the summit in particular has provided us with invaluable insights. And Mark, I'd be remiss if I didn't thank you for your leadership of SIEPR over the past many years. It's a real privilege for me to introduce Adriana Kugler today. She is the newest member of the Federal Reserve System's Board of Governors, taking office this past September, and is a highly respected economist with deep expertise in labor markets, worker mobility, and youth employment. She is also speaking extremely extensively recently on the core disinflation, on her view that core disinflation will continue in the future. She has a distinguished record of contributions in public service and academia spanning over 2 decades. Prior to her appointment to the Board of Governors, she served as the World Bank Group Executive Director for the United States. She is a professor of public policy and economics at Georgetown University, where she also served as vice provost for faculty. She served as chief economist at the U.S. Department of Labor from 2011 to 2013, and was also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research and at Stanford's Center for the Study of Poverty and Inequality, which is run by David Grusky, one of SIEPR's senior fellows. Again, I'm incredibly honored to welcome Governor Kugler today. As Mark mentioned, after her remarks, Mark is going to kick off the Q&A before opening things up to the audience. Governor Kugler, thank you so much for being with us at the SIEPR Economic Summit.
Thank you so much, Roger, for your generous remarks. And thank you, Mark, for the opportunity to be part of the discussions today. For more than 40 years, the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research has assisted economic policymakers, such as myself, by producing sharp analysis and fostering the kind of constructive dialogue reflected in today's agenda. My topic today is the Federal Reserve's dual mandate of maximum employment and stable prices, and specifically the trade-offs that sometimes arise when pursuing these 2 objectives. I say sometimes because there have been times and certain economic conditions in which such trade-offs did not arise, or at least were not apparent. This distinction is an important one, especially when considering the Federal Open Market Committee's or FOMC's recent progress in reducing high inflation while the labor market has remained strong. Better understanding the trade-offs or lack thereof in pursuing the dual mandate will help researchers and policymakers draw lessons from these welcome developments. In 1977, Congress legislated the Federal Reserve's dual mandate, under which the FOMC is required to pursue both maximum employment and stable prices, with both objectives in equal footing. At the outset, it is worth stressing that these goals are generally complementary, and I will return to this point shortly. But when they're not complementary, one way to think of the policy problem is precisely in terms of trade-offs. Maximum employment is the highest level of employment that will not cause inflation to escalate significantly above levels consistent with price stability. Before going into those trade-offs, I want to emphasize that achieving the committee's employment goal on an ongoing basis rests on achieving price stability. Price stability enables long-lasting economic expansions, which strengthen the labor market and expand employment opportunities. This process particularly benefits families and communities that are too often left behind. But it is appropriate to recognize also that trade-offs between the goals of maximum employment and price stability can occur in the short term. Indeed, the potential shorter-term trade-off between unemployment and inflation has long featured prominently among the economic considerations of policymakers. Government action to boost employment through fiscal and monetary stimulus has historically tended to increase aggregate spending and inflation too. On the contrary, actions to reduce inflation by shifting to contractionary fiscal or monetary policy have tended to slow economic activity and raise unemployment, or at least reduce the pace of job creation. The idea of a short-run trade-off is reflected in the regional specification of the Phillips curve, named after New Zealand economist A.W. Phillips, who plotted historical values of the UK's unemployment rate and growth in nominal wages between 1861 and 1957, showing an often inverse relationship between these two. And although the original Phillips curve was initially specified in terms of wages, later versions have more typically compared unemployment with price inflation. Taken at face value, a trade-off between keeping unemployment high and reducing inflation would seem to present policymakers with a dilemma. It suggests that when inflation is well above the levels associated with price stability, policymakers must engineer a significant increase in unemployment to bring down inflation. This inflation can be especially challenging when expectations of future inflation are high. And we actually saw this during the 1970s and 1980s, if you all remember. Convincing households and businesses that the FOMC was committed to reducing inflation required accepting a protracted, though ultimately temporary period of high unemployment, as then Fed Chair Paul Volcker came to believe. Volcker is widely credited with ending the great inflation experienced at that time through his willingness to induce a punishing recession. He lowered inflation and kept it down in substantial part by convincing the public that the Fed would keep inflation in check whatever the cost, thereby lowering expectations of future inflation. While long experience shows that there can be a trade-off between policy actions to pursue maximum employment and stable prices, there are times and conditions, as I have mentioned, when this is not the case, or at least there is little evidence of that trade-off. For example, for most of the decade after the Great Recession, FOMC policy was, by some measures at least, highly accommodative, yet inflation ran consistently below the committee's 2% target. So when inflation is below target and employment is below maximum sustainable levels, accommodative policy can be used to pursue both sides of the dual mandate. Academic economists have debated for decades about the circumstances in which this trade-off applies. One strand of this research literature proposes that a central bank can indeed achieve good economic outcomes by focusing on a single mandate, an inflation target, and that policies to promote stable prices can also secure low unemployment. In this view, a stabilization of inflation ensures that the economy performs at its optimal level, with firms producing just the right amount such that no resources, including workers, are left on the sidelines. This theory fits in a world in which economy is driven by demand. In such a case, shocks coming from the demand side of the economy can be offset by monetary policy, which also works via aggregate demand. But in the real world, things are not so simple. Demand shocks are not the only forces that can drive economic fluctuations. Supply shocks not only exist, but they can be large and persistent, as we have learned over the past several years. Adverse supply shocks, just like higher inflation expectations, make managing the trade-off between inflation and unemployment more difficult and costly indeed. While a sharp reduction in demand reduces both economic activity and inflation, a sharp reduction in supply, such as a sudden loss of global oil supply, increases inflation and reduces economic activity. Trying to combat inflation by raising interest rates would further reduce economic activity and employment, while reducing interest rates to boost economic activity and employment raises inflation even higher. Therefore, counteracting a persistent supply shock with monetary policy tools may help with one side of the mandate, but create even a larger deviation from the other side of the mandate. Let me now turn to the pandemic experience. Inflation picked up in 2021, and by mid-2022, 12-month inflation based on personal consumption expenditures, or PCE, hit 7%, well above the FOMC's 2% target. It was the most significant surge in inflation since the 1970s, prompting fears that it would raise expectations of future inflation and make getting inflation down again require a steep trade-off that is much higher unemployment. One more specific concern was that a so-called wage price spiral would emerge. In a tight labor market, expectations of continued high inflation can lead workers trying to maintain their living standards to demand higher raises. In a context of a strong aggregate demand, firms would likely grant the wage increases to retain their workers, then pass through the resulting cost increase as higher prices. To avoid a continuing spiral of this sort, demand and supply in labor and product markets must be rebalanced, either through lower aggregate demand, higher aggregate supply, or hopefully both. If achieving this balance requires a drastic reduction in aggregate demand, then sustainably taming inflation could require a high cost in terms of the employment mandate. Fortunately, we appear to have avoided a wage price spiral this time, as I will discuss later. As inflation rose and began to appear persistent, the FOMC rightly focused on restoring price stability, knowing that without price stability, the economy would not work for anyone, and that high inflation would ultimately undermine the strength of the labor market too. While interest rates rose rapidly, some feared that the cost of this inflation would be persistently elevated unemployment. But over the past year or so, that trade-off has been much less evident than many feared. We have seen inflation cool significantly, falling more rapidly than at any time since the 1980s. Yet, unemployment remains near the lowest levels seen only a few times since the 1960s. How have we managed to avoid the familiar trade-off during this period and see such welcome outcomes on both the inflation and employment fronts? I would propose a few possible reasons. These center on the fact that the pandemic inflation featured both supply and demand shocks. In the limited time that I have today, I will not propose to get into the debate about how much of this recent inflation was explained from supply as opposed to demand, but I will certainly discuss how both demand and supply forces have been important in the rise and then the fall in the inflation rate. The pandemic caused a significant reduction in supply in some areas of the economy. Limits on the supply of goods resulted from restricted output in many industries. Consider a key US manufacturing industry, auto production. And I know you heard this morning from a key leader in that sector. In 2019, the US manufactured 10.5 million light vehicles. In 2020, production plunged to 8.5 million, with pandemic-related plant shutdowns followed by worldwide shortages of computer chips and other parts. It has taken the industry a long time to recover. Auto production was less than 9 million in 2021, and a bit under 10 million in 2022. Constrained vehicle supply played a big role in boosting auto prices. And it wasn't just motor vehicles. For example, you might recall reports of food processing plant shutdowns, and many other goods producing industries also suffered from lost output. US industrial production dropped at the onset of the pandemic and then remained below its pre-pandemic level until early in 2022, despite a strong demand for physical goods. Indeed, evidence shows that output was held down by insufficient supply of materials. But supply problems were not only limited to goods. Indeed, insufficient supply of labor has also been widely cited by businesses as having held down output. Labor supply was suddenly and severely limited early in the pandemic as workers voluntarily, but also sometimes involuntarily, stayed out of the workforce. The labor force did not recover to pre-pandemic levels until mid-2022. Older workers in particular left the labor market in large numbers. But even many prime-age workers, those between the ages of 25 and 54, withdrew because of school disruptions and health concerns, and prime-age labor force participation remained below its pre-pandemic level until early in 2023, just last year. A slowdown in immigration, likewise, deprived the economy of a customary source of labor supply growth, as did elevated mortality due to COVID-19. Fortunately, these supply shortages for both goods and labor have mostly dissipated, though not totally, but they have mostly dissipated. For example, auto production in 2023 nearly regained its 2019 level, and industrial production, as well as various goods supply indicators, have returned close to their pre-pandemic levels. Congestion in logistics and transportation networks eased, and firms sometimes found alternative supply chain networks. In the labor market, shortages directly related to the pandemic have eased, helping restore labor force participation, likely in part due to the reopening of schools, progress in the health situation, and help from childcare subsidies and other programs. Increased capabilities for remote work, allowing for a decoupling between firm and worker location, also expanded the pool of available workers and jobs. More broadly, strong labor demand has enticed more workers into the labor market, to the point that labor force participation among prime-age workers is now above pre-pandemic levels, especially for prime-age women, for whom it hit a record high in the middle of last year. And immigration has rebounded as well. Another more subtle source of labor market supply recovery has been improvements in the quality of matches between firms and workers. At any time, a crucial factor that affects labor supply is how well the skills of available workers fulfill the needs of employers. With labor in many sectors in short supply and very high numbers of job openings, many workers quit their jobs to move to new ones. Economists generally believe that increased labor turnover improves worker-firm matches. Workers find better jobs that make better use of their skills, typically with higher wages, and firms find workers that are better suited for those businesses and are more productive at their jobs. Economic expansions, such as the one that we have seen since 2020, present some opportunities for workers to find a better match. And it appears that workers and firms were pretty much efficient at finding each other over the past couple of years, likely upgrading the average quality of a job match in the process. Higher quality job worker matches improve the productivity of workers, serving like a boost to labor supply. If reductions in supply contributed to inflation, then recovery of that supply would help lower inflation too. Supply improvements in the goods sector have helped ease inflation starting in early 2022. For example, in January, the 12-month growth of new motor vehicle prices was less than 1%, far slower than its peak above 13% in the spring of 2022. More broadly, the overall level for core PCE goods prices, which excludes food and energy, was fairly flat last year and actually declined in recent months. On the labor side, supply recovery has likely contributed to this inflation by helping to ease the pace of wage growth, especially in the labor-intensive services industries. For private services as a whole, 12-month nominal wage growth, as measured by average hourly earnings, was 4.5% in January, down from its peak of 5.9% in early 22. And sure enough, price inflation in services has also slowed. In core PCE services, which accounts for roughly 3/4 of core PCE, 12-month inflation was 4.1% in January, down substantially from its peak of 5.8% last year. But supply is not the only factor behind the slowing of inflation. Policies affecting aggregate demand have played a role as well. On the fiscal side, measures of the impact of government spending in economic growth turned negative in 2021 after being strongly supportive in 2020. And in terms of monetary policy, the FOMC's actions in late 2021 indicated a sooner than previously anticipated start to policy rate increases, with the FOMC beginning to raise the target range from the federal funds rate in March of 2022. After that, the committee tightened its stance of policy expeditiously. The result can be seen especially in areas of the economy that are sensitive to financial conditions. The housing sector, for example, saw a significant slowdown, with residential investment declining more than 15% in 2022 and remaining flat in 2023. Growth of investment in equipment was tepid last year as well, likely due in part to restrictive financial conditions, even as we have seen growth in manufacturing construction that will help address remaining supply-side bottlenecks. Aside from these examples of subdued spending in policy-sensitive sectors, we can also really see the imprint of monetary policy in anchoring inflation expectations. Even amid high inflation, households, businesses, and financial markets as well believed that inflation would eventually return to its target level. By raising policy rates expeditiously and communicating clearly, the committee demonstrated its resolve to lower inflation to 2% and its commitment to the price stability side of the mandate. Anchored inflation expectations are apparent, for example, in the popular Michigan surveys. We just got the third revision today, in fact. Expectations of inflation for the period covering the next 5 to 10 years have remained relatively stable over the pandemic and close to levels that we saw prior to the pandemic. And shorter-term expectations rose in 2021, but have come back more recently. anchored inflation expectations likely matter for actual price setting. That is, in fact, what modern theories of the Phillips curve suggest. And the relevance of the theoretical expectations has been suggested by surveys reported by staff at the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. The data show a close relationship between firms' expectations for overall inflation and those firms' own price-setting plans. Crucially, by keeping inflation expectations well anchored, the FOMC has slightly forestalled the development of a wage price spiral of the kind that I mentioned earlier, while also creating conditions in which inflation has been able to peak at a lower level than otherwise. Indeed, real wage growth, that is, growth of wages after accounting for inflation, has turned positive, which means workers' income is rising now faster than the cost of living, and that's a welcome development. These developments help bring us back to the inflation-unemployment trade-off that started my discussion today. The pandemic experience has shown that the nature of that trade-off changes with economic conditions, as does the steepness of the Phillips curve. I will close by making two more general observations about the changes that we have seen during the pandemic and its aftermath, with some suggestions about open questions for researchers moving forward. First, supply curves, as economists say, are convex. That means that the slope increases sharply after quantity supply reaches a certain level, and that means that prices rise very, very quickly. The steep part of the supply curve can come into play when demand nears the limits of an industry's capacity. That would happen either because of an unusually large increase in demand or because of a temporary reduction in industry capacity, or both. Research has shown this is the case for individual industries, even in the pre-pandemic period. During the pandemic, many industries experienced large demand shocks or supply curtailment that contributed to inflation, as I have already discussed. And those same shocks that I discussed also may have exacerbated the inflationary effects by pushing many industries up that steep part of the supply curve. Early in the pandemic, the convexity or steepness of industry supply curves was quite costly in terms of our inflation mandate. But it has likely helped much more recently, as we have apparently moved back down the steep part of the supply curves in many industries as well, which has slowed rapidly inflation and has caused the rapid disinflation likely that we have been seeing. An open question in the longer term is whether this process has helped firms to learn much more about supply chains, inventory investment, such that we might not actually find that steep part of the supply curve in the future. Second, with regards to the Phillips curve specifically, I know that in a large class of models, the steepness of the Phillips curve is partly a function of how frequently firms adjust their prices. And that seems to be borne by recent experience as well. Before the pandemic, the typical price tag lasted more than 10 months. And this figure was reasonably stable for many years. But the pandemic seems to have moved firms into a regime of more frequent price adjustments, that is, shorter price duration. By early 2022, the typical price was lasting less than 5 months. Price adjustment frequency has since slowed back down, with the latest data from the third quarter of last year suggesting prices were lasting nearly 7 months. Continued slowing of price adjustment frequency is an indicator that firms' costs are rising less quickly and that the economy is moving back down the supply curve and the Phillips curve as well. Interestingly, though, in the workhorse models in economics for studying monetary policy and the economy, the frequency of price adjustments is often considered constant. Of course, economists have thought about this in the past, but a greater understanding of relationships between price adjustment decisions of individual firms and overall inflation is definitely an important area for further academic research. For the reasons I have been discussing, I am cautiously optimistic that we will see continued progress on disinflation without significant deterioration in the labor market. With respect to the inflation and unemployment trade-off, we have certainly learned a lot during the pandemic, but there is still much more to learn. In particular, I look forward to further research that can enrich the economics profession understanding of the inflation and unemployment trade-off and the Phillips curve, and continue also informing policymakers such as myself. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Governor Kugler, for the remarks. Adriana, it's okay. Is it okay?
Yes, of
we
course.
go way back. So
we definitely go
anyway, I don't want to be too informal, but so in any case, super insightful. I wish actually that I could have had you come here a week ago, because I just had to teach inflation and unemployment this past week in Econ 1. But it was, but it is great. I know there are some Econ 1 students here, so I hope you drank in what Governor Kugler just shared. But I'm just going to ask you a couple of questions and then open it up to the audience. And so the first is just if you can talk a bit about what you think have been the causes and consequences of the recent declines in earnings inequality. There's been a lot about that recently, and perhaps it's just a temporary blip, but that has attracted a lot of attention of late, and what your thoughts are on that front.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mark. And it's such a pleasure to be with you again. We spent some time together in Washington about a decade ago.
Exactly.
It's great to be here, and I really appreciate your question, because one of the most striking features of the post-pandemic recovery has been that the groups that have benefited the most during this recovery have been the most disadvantaged. Right. So the Atlanta Fed wage growth tracker, which follows different groups as well, basically shows that the wage growth advantage during this recovery period has been mainly experienced by those in the lowest quartile of the earnings distribution, by non-college workers as opposed to college workers, by non-white workers as opposed to white workers. So generally, during a recovery, what happens is the first ones to benefit are those who are already doing fairly well. This time around, it has been the inverse. And in fact, in 2021, 2022, what you saw is that this wage growth advantage was really high for those in the lowest quartile and even the second quartile of the earnings distribution. Now, there are some recent studies that actually show that possibly 40% of the compression that we're seeing in the earnings distribution has been erased from the past 4 decades of that earnings increase in inequality that we saw. So it seems to be very consequential. So that's on the earnings side. Interestingly, you can also talk about compression and wealth inequality. So in terms of wealth, everyone has benefited actually, but it's those in the lower half of the wealth distribution that have also benefited the most. And that's probably likely because many of those in the lower half hold their assets as home equity. And we have seen increases in values of homes, and that probably has helped that increase in wealth. Now that's all good for the economy, because it's precisely those people in the lower part of the earnings distribution and lower part of the wealth distribution that have the highest propensity to consume. They spend the most for every additional dollar they get. They spend about 50 cents to the dollar. Those in the very higher end, in the higher quartiles, tend to spend about maybe 12 cents to the dollar. So it matters in the sense that it will keep the economy going, it will keep consumption going, it will keep the labor market going, and employment also up. So it could have some good consequences overall too.
Wonderful, thank you so much for that. So we're And thank you for making the trip all the way out here. I owe you an even bigger thank you than yours to me. It is, we're so grateful to you for coming here and sharing your insights. So the next question that I have for you is sort of related to a topic we'll be hearing more about this afternoon, as to the effects of artificial intelligence, which we hear a lot about here in Silicon Valley especially, and other technologies on workers throughout the earnings distribution. And you know this literature better than I do on earnings inequality and skill-biased technological change. And in general, over the last 4-ish decades, technologies have tended to amplify rather than attenuate inequality. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on this, given the recent experience, what we've seen in the data and so forth.
Yeah, I guess the short question, Mark, with regards to the impacts of AI is we just don't know. It's too early to tell. But I am very happy to share some general thoughts in terms of how I think AI may impact the labor market. In general, the way we think about it is that it will likely be a general purpose technology, just like electrification, just like steam power, right? It's going to be something that can probably have broad effects across many sectors of the economy. So that's something that we expect. It could create improvements in production processes, but also increase productivity in terms of R&D. So that's kind of what we expect. But as I said, it's too early to tell because everyone we've talked to, and we talk to people in many different sectors back in DC, and we don't only stay in DC. Luckily, we get out in the country and we talk to everybody. We have heard that there's some good examples of applications to AI, but right now it's not as broadly based as one would hope, but I think we can expect that will start expanding.
Nice.
In terms of the impact on the labor market, I would say we can expect AI to have productivity impacts on workers. And I would say not only workers, but mainly tasks, right? There may be part of the job that a worker does that is substituted or replaced by AI and machine learning. There are other parts that may be complemented. So there could be substitution, there could be enhancing of the productivity of those workers that performs those tasks because of AI. But I think something that people don't think about too much is that there could be even a new set of tasks that get generated as a result of AI, right? So web design, programmers, I mean, there are many new skills that will be needed to perform specific tasks as a result of AI. Now, who's going to be affected? I think manual workers may be in that group where their skills are actually complemented by AI. Those working behind screens and desks may be substituted. Those at the higher end, those who perform R&D, for example, will certainly see enhancements. So it may be more of a hollowing of the earnings or income distribution that AI has, just like we have seen in the past as well. But again, it's too early to tell. This is all speculative at this point, right?
Interesting. Okay, great. Well, we'll probably hear more about that this afternoon as well. But now I want to give an opportunity to people. I have plenty of questions to last all afternoon, actually. But let's see. We've got a question back here, right here.
Hi. Thank you for coming here. So could you make any comments or add some color to the concept discussed in the panel before lunch that probably against the will of the entity, the Federal Reserve is being forced to get involved in fiscal policy due to the $3 trillion that you hold on your assets, that you hold on your balance sheet?
So we don't get involved in fiscal policy. That's not our mandate. That's just not something that we do, and I don't think me or any of my colleagues are trying to get on that side of what government policy does. That belongs to Congress, it belongs to the administration, it belongs to others. We don't play a role. We consider it certainly making our decisions because they're critical, right? We pay attention to everything. Potential shutdowns, increases in spending, where that spending goes, because there could be, right, that some of that spending tackles supply side bottlenecks. We consider all these issues, But we do not get involved in trying to influence any of those decisions on fiscal policy because it's not for us to do.
Okay, additional question. We've got Jeanette right here. Hopefully someone can get her. May have picked. Okay, here we go. Thank you so much, Bethany.
Thank you. Several years ago, more than a few years ago, at this conference, Chairman Powell elaborated on the new Fed policy. I think we call it still average inflation targeting. In the setting of looking not just at the short-term inflation numbers, but a longer period of time, and setting policy with an allowance that inflation would run above average for a while and then could run below average, and so on. I think you have teed up sometime this year a regularly scheduled review of those policies, just what is relevant. I wonder if you could share some thoughts about what you're thinking about as you step towards that discussion.
Yeah, thank you. I have to say we haven't actually started or even determined a date when we will consider the revision of the framework, which is what you're talking about. So I have to say it's too early. We haven't commented on those issues at all amongst members of the FOMC, and we are laser focused on bringing down inflation to 2%, and that's what we're doing right now.
Okay, I believe we have time for perhaps one more question from the audience, and let's see if we've got we've got a question right here from Winston. Could we please get a microphone to Winston? Thank you, Ben, for doing this.
Well, from the press conference, I heard about Chairman Powell's compensation. It seems to me is such a ridiculous, out of proportion, it's so low. I mean, how do we fix this problem? You guys are doing such a great job and big contribution. I think it's a systems problem. We got to take care of this problem. Tell us how can we help to fix this problem?
Wait, which problem? I didn't hear. What
compensation of the board
okay.
governors. It's something like $180,000 a year.
So they should pay her more. Is that?
Everyone on the board.
Okay, yeah. So do you want to comment on this? Yes, of course.
I am very grateful, Winston, for your comment. I have to say, we enter into these jobs, and because you've been in public service, not because of the compensation. We want to serve the country. We want to do the very best for the economy as a whole, for the U.S., so that's not why we get into these jobs. I came from Georgetown University, where I'm a professor on leave. It's not a consideration when one takes up one of these jobs. It's Congress that determines what the limit of what we can get paid is. But I do appreciate your confidence in terms of the good job that we're doing. That I very much appreciate. I will definitely not ask you to try to advocate for any changes in our compensation, because that's not why I got into this job. I am glad to be serving the country. I am glad to be doing our best to taking these decisions very seriously for the well-being of all of us. Thank you.
I do have to, yeah. I mean, I do have to say, I'll just say in hindsight, a year ago at this same summit, when we were looking ahead, if you had told us that inflation would have come down as much as it has and unemployment would be where it is, I think 3.7%, I don't think hardly anyone in this room would have thought that was true. So it's a pretty remarkable experience. And what exactly is the driver of all of this is, of course, complicated. As you know, macroeconomy is a complicated thing to study, but it is so grateful to you. And I'm just wondering if you can stay for a few days so you can come to my Econ 1 class on Tuesday and share some more of your insights. But with that, please, I think we're out of time, so please join me in thanking Governor Kugler for coming.